growth and investment in Africa. I think what we need to understand about Africa, I will suggest that you YouTube Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's speech of 1958 in Accra, and also his speech at the Organization of African Unity in 1963. That should be the background for you if you are dealing with Africa and private sector development and industrialization. We believe that the 54 countries in Africa are not viable as a political entity to create the needs, meet the needs of the people in Africa. What do I mean by that? Now the focus has been for the last 3 years, and it's going to be more so now that Donald Trump is in power, that it's a private sector that's going to create changes, create jobs and wealth in Africa. And if you know the function of capital, you'll find out that you cannot invest in these micro countries. In the 60s, we were saying they're not viable. It took you guys to the 70s and 80s to start talking about fragile states. Okay? So for you to invest in Africa and get a return on your investment, less risk, the small countries are not, the countries in Africa, even the large one, in the long run are not viable for your investment. So there needs to be a political federation in Africa. If you don't have it, there will never be any industrialization in Africa. The $90 billion deficit in infrastructure, annual deficit for infrastructure development, that they're having a hard time, the African Development Bank, meeting, is because investors are not going to put their money in those type of things when they know in the long run it's like pouring you up down the morning down the drain. For you to have successful enterprise, entrepreneurship, you have to have the ability to scale your enterprise. If you cannot, then you're wasting your money. It's just like you jump from a skyscraper 70 floor, and when you get to the 50, you said, so far so good. Or you're taking a long walk on a short pier. Now, what I always try to do when I meet with people and talk about development in Africa, with the people who are into, IMF, World Bank, all those people, I tell them, if you don't understand what legacy thinking is, to sunk cost fallacy, perception set, selective perception, time consistency in economy, fixed mindset, 60 years of failure in Africa in trying to do development, scaling of enterprises, making room for experimental. The African elite is not, the African elite, the intellectual elite of Africa, are not like other ones in other parts of the world. They lack geopolitics and geoeconomics strategy. They don't understand those things. Somebody was talking about realist and idealist. All that is rubbish if you don't know about geopolitics and geoeconomics. Now, why do we have, this is what you should think, why do you have so many successful large-scale enterprises in Nigeria, South Africa? Why? Why are there so many multi-millionaires and multi-billionaires in Nigeria and South Africa, and a few in Kenya, which is the largest economy in East Africa? Because those economies are large. So you could imagine if you have the political federation, which is going to happen, because we were the ones who recruited Gaddafi and others 31 years ago to this project. It was 2015, and that's why they killed Gaddafi, to prevent this. Now, if you in this room now, you have multi-millionaires and multi-billionaires who have assets in Africa, and you ask them, will they oppose the creation of the political federation? They will tell you no. They will support it, because that's the way their own Dangotes and others, their businesses, trust me, will become fragile and eventually failed unless we have a political federation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kamisa Kamara. I'm the Africa Director at Partners Global. Partners Global is a DC-based NGO that works on governance and democracy projects. We're an implementer. I am so in charge of the Africa program, and I do implement projects funded by the US government, the Europeans, etc., all over Africa. One of the main themes of the projects that we implement are the full participation of women in the different security sector reform activities that we conduct, because security sector reform is one of our specialties. So for this panel, I was asked to discuss quota systems and women representation in Africa. It's really hard to do that in 3.5 minutes, but I will try. There are a few important comments that I would like to make about the quota systems. I have read a few articles recently that do say or do claim and argue that quota systems have changed the history of women around the world, and particularly in Africa. My argument is that quota systems are useful, they're necessary. But in Africa, they do apply at the national level. And in countries where quota systems have been successful, it is really women who have changed the history of women. The successful example that comes to mind all the time is the example of Rwanda, where women participation in parliament is over 50%. You can consider Rwanda a success story by saying that, well, you know, maybe quota systems have worked there, but the story there is more complicated than that. Quota systems have been extremely useful and helpful in post-conflict societies. It is the post-conflict Liberia that has elected the first women president in Africa. It is a post-apartheid South Africa that has had a constitution that was very women-friendly. And it is a post-genocide Rwanda that has made it possible for women to be represented over 50% by over 50% in parliament. And that is mainly because during conflicts, during crisis, women do tend to assume non-traditional roles. The men are gone, they're either dead or they went to fight a war. And women become the head of the household, the breadwinner. And because of that, after the war or after the crisis, they do embrace whatever revolution is going on, and they became the main political actors. And the men then do not have a choice but to include them because they have played a critical role when they were gone. A few things about quota systems. Gender-based quotas do end male dominance in politics, and it's not about taking power away from men, but it's asking them to share power with their better halves. Gender-based quotas are mostly about numbers, and gender-based quotas are, in my opinion, a paradoxical measure instituted to break male dominance in politics. To come back to the example of Rwanda, the reason why women representation has been so successful in Rwanda is that it has been applied at the national level, but also at the regional and at the local levels at the same time. The top-down policies that have been implemented by the Rwandan government have been very women-friendly, and women civil society organizations have embraced that revolution and have pushed the agenda forward. That is why they are so well represented. So to conclude quickly, quota systems are critical in order to reverse male dominance in politics, but it is really women movements that push those agendas forward and that make sure that their representation is sustainable at the national, at the regional, and at the local level. Another important point that I would like to make before I stop is that women representation at the national level, you can call them the elite of political society, does not necessarily translate at the regional and at the local level. It is once all of these three happen at the same time, national, regional, and local level, that you can see a sustainable change happening. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Saskia Brechenmacher, and I'm an Associate Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We are a foreign policy-focused think tank here in DC, and I am affiliated with their Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. So we do research on trends globally in democracy, but also focus specifically on international democracy assistance and governance assistance. One of our main lines of work over the past few years has been on trends in civic activism around the world and also restrictions on civil society and freedom of association. Because as some of you might know, over the past decade or decade and a half, we've seen a proliferation in many parts of the world, including in sub-Saharan Africa, of new restrictive measures that try to curtail citizens' ability to organize, to protest, to get together independently from the state. So what we've been trying to do with our research is understand the drivers of this trend, but also follow up on what are the local implications, the consequences, how are people fighting back, and also what is the role of international actors in pushing back against this trend, and is there a role for international donor organizations, for example. So I wanted to briefly just touch on a few trends that I think I see in sub-Saharan Africa that become clear in the research on this issue, but also talk a little bit about a recent project that I worked on, which looked specifically on attacks on the legitimacy of civil society activism, including in countries like Uganda and Kenya, where that's been a very pressing issue over the past several years. So I would argue that repression of civil society is nothing new. It's always been around, especially in undemocratic societies. But we see now across sub-Saharan Africa quite negative trends, despite, of course, significant regional variation still. I think what is particularly striking is that those trends are no longer just confined to very close societies like the DRC or Sudan, etc., where for a long time it's been very difficult for citizens to organize, but increasingly also in more democratic governments or societies like Nigeria and Kenya. And also it comes at a time now when the international human rights architecture is already under stress and international democratic governance norms are also more under stress. And what I mean by that is that when we look at the international level or the global level, we see a greater assertiveness, right, of some authoritarian countries. We also see traditional defenders of human rights being less outspoken about these issues or changing course. So there's been an attack, even at the very international and global level, on basic rights such as freedom of association and the right of civil society organizations to receive foreign funding, for example. So that means that puts a lot of extra pressure on local activists who no longer necessarily have the backing they once had in the past, even though that backing obviously was not always sufficient. We recently published a study that examined specifically government attacks on civil society's legitimacy. So one thing we noted that often these attacks don't only take the form of legislative or regulatory measures, but also in terms of smear campaigns, so governments using control of the media, using their public platforms to portray activists or civil society in a very negative light. And there are certain strategies that you see again and again across sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other parts of the world. And these fall into, I would say, 4 categories. One being that civil society is self-appointed rather than elected, so they're not democratically legitimate actors in that sense. And secondly, that they're accountable to external rather than domestic constituencies because they receive foreign support. A third, that they're partisan political actors rather than non-partisan civic actors. I think that was something that was very striking, for example, in the Kenyan election campaign. And also that they're elite actors that are not representative to the people that they claim to represent. So we see these strategies that again, and I know I'm out of time, so I'll stop here, but maybe later on in the discussion I'm happy to come back to some of the themes of what we found in terms of how civil society can fight back against these attacks on legitimacy and also what the role of international actors is in that process.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Tomaszewski, call me JT. I'm the Africa Regional Director for the International Republican Institute. The International Republican Institute, IRI, is one of 4 core institutes under the National Endowment for Democracy. And we do a lot of implementation on the ground. We've worked in about 100 countries around the world, and we're currently working in about 16 in sub-Saharan Africa with 9 offices. Our work is wide-ranging in terms of democracy and governance work, everything from observing elections to strengthening political parties to working with civil society on advocacy to even doing youth and women programming for political empowerment and engagement. We also do local governance work. I've been asked to talk about 2 things. One is a little bit about the whole term limits issue and some of the institutional stuff. but also about sort of the U.S. Position and sort of where the U.S. is in terms of Africa assistance, and especially in the democracy and governance space. First, one thing that we're seeing grow in size across the continent is the use of existing legal mechanisms and constitutional loopholes to extend leadership power. We're also watching in a number of countries, most notably, we saw this happen in a place like DRC and of course in Rwanda, but also we're watching in places like Zimbabwe, where we have elections coming up and IRI is observing elections there. Efforts to undermine certain parts of the legal process to benefit the ruling party in power. And what we really try to point out those issues, work with civil society to highlight those things. But maybe just because it's such a short amount of time here, to talk really quickly about sort of where we are in terms of the U.S. situation in Africa and the administration's role. First, just so you know, IRI is not affiliated with the Republican Party. We're nonpartisan and a nonprofit institution. My commentary really focuses more on sort of the trend we're seeing in the democracy governance space. For the 8 years under Obama, what we saw, according to Interaction, which is sort of an NGO group that sort of looks at things like development assistance, we saw about a 40% decline in its funding. In the past 2 years, we've actually seen that increase, and we've seen that Africa grow in size and scope in terms of priority in the U.S. Congress. There's a $100 million fund that the U.S. Congress has put in called the Democracy Fund that is being used extensively in Africa. IRI is a recipient of some of those funds, and we're now seeing that grow in size. Even the National Endowment for Democracy has received additional funding, not only through its basic core programming, but also a number of contingency projects that allows it to do more rapid response and rapid reaction on the continent. We also now have leading the agency, U.S. Agency for International Development, an African expert in Mark Green, which is very helpful. And the U.S. currently is struggling from the State Department front with a lot of ambassadorial posts still unfilled and only now finally getting an assistant secretary. So there are a lot of challenges which make our work difficult, but also I think we're seeing some positive movement.
So I've been working in Africa for over 25 years. Started when I was about 40 years old, so I'm now 67, and traveled out the continent. I write extensively on economic development. I think that which almost every problem in the countries I've studied in Africa can be derived from. And as a segue from the previous discussions this morning, frankly, you cannot have real democracy without a standard of living for people that's progressive and allows those people to have the quality of life and energy and water and food, so they have the time to think and discuss national policy for their country. If their parents are fighting each day to find water and food for their children, if you know electricity in your house, if you don't have books to read, you're not going to have a democratic republic, as our founding fathers indicate. And as a segue also from human rights, the most fundamental human right, there is no, that human rights is not even a consideration at that point. So these are some of the most fundamental issues which I think we have looked at, I've looked at in Africa. I promote transformative infrastructure policies, what is now being called Pan-African policies, and I just conducted a participant in a conference in Abuja, which I'd like to show you a couple of things on, but I'll just go through quickly a couple of things that I think people should look at. Of course, Africa is a huge continent. Most people know how big it is. And it's not connected by infrastructure. Kwame Nkrumah in 1963, and again in the book Africa Must Unite, talked about the need for infrastructure to develop the continent. And for most of the period of time, up until a recent period of few years, it was only limited to colonial railroads to bring in armies or bring a port. This shows you one of the problems. This is the Sahara Desert, size of the continental United States. One of the driest and largest desert in the world, as big as the United States. This shows you the problem. No electricity. This is a picture of Africa at night, and you can compare it to Europe. This gives you an idea. Africa has about 100,000 megawatts of power, sub-Saharan Africa. 40,000 comes from South Africa. There is no electricity in Africa. If you were to have a standard of living like all of us in this room for Africa, Africa needs 1,600 gigawatts of power. Nigeria needs 250,000 megawatts for its almost 200 million people. This is the conditions of life in Zamzam, Darfur, where I spent a few nights. People spending 4 to 5 hours a day just getting water. This is the background of children. And you can see the conditions of life in the IDPs in Darfur, where I was. This is what the African Union is proposing, which is very good, which would be crisscrossing. This is just roads that would connect the continent, and this is part of the AU program for 2063. This is where we have to come in on energy and rail. This is the Grand Inca, which would provide power, essentially 50,000 megawatts. And the idea is to provide power from the south and north parts of the continent. It's little or no support around the world. In fact, the major country supporting the Grand Inca is South Africa. But this has to become a major policy. This is something that was written about in the 1950s by Chikante Diop on the question of power in Africa. This is the other major power. This is now near completion. This is the Grand Renaissance Dam, where the Ethiopians are building a dam that's 40 miles from the Sudan border to take water from the Blue Nile, which is the major contributor to the Nile. This will be 6,200 gigawatts, the largest power source in Africa. It's about halfway through completion. This is what an artist's picture will look like. This is a new train that was just built, a train run by electricity, the first one in sub-Saharan Africa from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, done with help of the Chinese, employing Djiboutians and Ethiopian workers, $4 billion, and this is where it goes, Addis to Djibouti. And these connection points are all going to be connected to highways, which are going to be leading to industrial parks. In my view, Ethiopia has the most advanced conception of economic development. This is me standing in front of the train. I was at the Norfolk train. This is the inside of the train. This is brand new. I was there at the inauguration October 2016. These are leaders now. On the right is Salva-Kiir, Paul Kagame, Kenyatta. This is Vice Premier of China. And there is the Ugandan President Museveni. What are they celebrating? This. The standard gauge, which is now going to go from Kenya all the way through to connect up and go to DRC, Uganda, Rwanda.
Dr. Freeman, as you wrap up, we'll get to the questions because we're going to have it looped maybe.
I'm going to say it again. Phase one is completed again. $3 to $4 billion done with the Chinese, employed 25,000 Kenyans in employment. This is the Tanzania. We're building a train line to the west. So for the first time now, we have trains being built. Tanzania, Ethiopia, Kenya. This is Nigeria. It's the southern rim of Nigeria from Calabar to Lagos. This is the first time these trains are being built. This is the one from Lagos going to Abuja, going to Kano, the largest city in the north. This is $40 billion. Again, the Chinese are involved and employ 100,000 workers. This is an east-west train which should have been built 50 years ago.
Wow.
It changed Africa. And this is the last project is the, one second, almost done. This is Lake Chad. This is Lake Chad that has been shrinking from 25,000 square kilometers to 52,000 today. And I've been advocating a program. This is how shallow the lake is. Those are ankles of water. I was on a canoe trip through there.
Dr.
This
Freeman,
is a project.
give you an
Yes,
opportunity.
this is Transact. This is a Pan-African major transformation program, the biggest project in Africa today. To take water from the Congo River by a series of dams, create a canal to connect up with Central African Republic and lead it to Lake Chari to expand Lake Chari at the top. This has now been supported for the very first time. I've been advocating this for 25 years. We had a conference, I spoke at it. These are the heads of the Lake Chad Basin Commission, President Bahari in the center, and they adopted the Trans-Aqua program. There's a feasibility study now supported. This is the Chinese Silk Road. Now it kind of goes right up the coast there.
Dr. Truman, you've been very busy, and we appreciate it. We're going to have you probably comment more.
Limit within the constitutions. Another question we need to ask ourselves, do term limit foster democracy or political stability or economic growth? Do the notion of term limit, can it see as a panacea? Those are the questions I'm going to attempt to answer in 5 minutes. Surprising to many people, the US actually, when the Constitution was written, didn't have term limits in the US. It basically took 150 years before term limits were introduced in the US Constitution. The first president, George Washington, elected 2 times, decided to retire after their second time, and it became like a convention. So every president that came after had at most 2 terms. Even and then it became in around the 1940s when President Roosevelt came into power, and the country was in turmoil because of the World War II that was taking place, and so he was elected 4 times basically, and then actually did the 3 terms, and the 4th term died, and so he was replaced by the vice president. So term limit was actually established in the US at that time. But the funny, interesting part is that every single president, and I counted 8 of them, from George Washington all the way to Roosevelt, none of them none of them actually were candidate or postulated for a 3rd term. And that's, to me, it was actually very interesting that this convention was established. So when we look at all these countries right now at this moment, in America, of course, we know we have term limits, and even some president like Obama suggested that if they run again, they will win. Reagan did the same thing, but we know that now term limits are in this country and everybody respects them. That's the same thing we kind of want for Africa. And we've seen a lot of changes in Africa that have taken place. We've seen, for instance, in Rwanda, in Uganda, so Museveni has eliminated the term limit in 2005. In Rwanda, in 2015, there was an article that was reviewed, Article 101, to eliminate, not to eliminate term limit, but to allow President Kagame to actually, from 2017, to go for 7 terms and then to go for another 5 terms. And so that allowed him to stay at around 35 or 37 years in office. You have also in Nigeria, Obasanjo, who attempted, after his 2 terms, to change also the constitution so he could run for another 3rd term. You had in Burundi, the president Nkurunziza changed the term, actually changed the constitution, and because of the change in the constitution, there was a war basically, and the country right now is unstable. You have in Senegal, Abdoulaye Wade attempted to change the term limit, the 3rd term, but was defeated through a vote. Benin, Yaya Boni, the same thing, failed, attempted to change term limit. Burkina Faso, Blaise Compaoré, attempted to do the same thing, but also was not successful. Kabila, as JT suggested a minute ago, basically this is a president whose term has run out, but is trying to do everything possible to remain in power. Congo-Brazzaville, we know the example of Sassou Nguesso, who has been in power since 1979. And the country is actually in turmoil at this moment because, again, the president has changed the term limit. I wanted to talk more about Congo-Brazzaville because it's a very specific case, but since I don't have much time, I'm just going to answer to the question that I basically asked. The question is that there is in people's nature a desire of freedom. So people innate aspiration for change, I think, encourage term limit. The modern idea of democracy, leaders are no longer appointed by God or by an inheritance from a sort of a dynasty. The secularization of power following the separation between the state and the church. The notion of accountability. Leaders need to be accountable to their people. When you don't have a term limit, most of these African presidents we see are maintaining themselves in position of power and placing their family members so to sustain the power within the family. So therefore, the leaders do not become accountable to the people. Eric, how many more minutes do I have?
30 seconds.
30 seconds, okay. Term limit foster democracy, political stability, yes. Democratic terms, and, well, let me just, let me conclude, because I only have 30 seconds. Yes, I would say that term limits push leaders or give incentives to leaders to work hard because they want to be re-elected and they want to leave a legacy. 2, the weak institutions, countries that have weak institutions, it's easier basically when you have those weak institutions to roll out the term limits. I also worry about the influence of China in Africa because China does not push the ideas of democracy. They don't care about democracy. And so it gives Western nations who are more inclined to pushing democracy less leverage to actually push the ideas of term limit within the countries. And it gave basically this African dictator another alternative than Europe. So I've been told to shut up, so I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Mebe. I want to say that to all of our, in terms of your closing remarks, so hopefully you can expand a little bit on your presentation. We want to open it up for discussions, and hopefully more of your presentation will also be teased out of it. And so thank you very much. Now I know that initially we were pushed to finish by 3 o'clock. And as you can see, even with that tight schedule, Dr. Freeman, that we're at 3:18, so we're a little bit over. But I think we're doing well. We want to open it up for some questioning. I do want to say that, Dr. Mebe, you talked a little bit about the influence of China. And so with the moderator's prerogative, I would like to open it up. I'd love to hear from our good friend from IRI as well on that. Dr. Freeman, as you talk about infrastructure building, and there's been a lot of movement, there's a tremendous amount of investment on China's part. So with all of the distinguished panelists, you know, the National Endowment, or, the Carnegie Group used to be, when to see where your investment is in Africa at this stage. Getting back to the last 3 years, for example, you see it going up, you see it going down. And are you as well concerned for the influence of China? What does that mean for Africa? What does it mean for democracy? But most importantly, what does it mean for the standard of living of the average African? So, anyone want to take it first? Let's start with IRI, for example. I know that you mentioned IRI is nonpartisan, although we've always felt as if there's been always a thinking out there that IRI is the other side of the coin, which is NDI. I speak on that a little bit, but speak mostly on the concern for the influence of China in Africa.
Sure. When the National Endowment was set up in the 1980s by the U.S. Congress, the Congress initially was going to follow the model of the Germans, party institutes. Obviously, due to a number of foreign assistance laws, they couldn't do that, so they ended up creating 2 institutes that represent the two-party system.
Yes.
We don't necessarily practice partisanship overseas. In fact, it's illegal to use foreign money to lobby in those ways, and both IRI and NDI work across the political spectrum. And of course in Africa, where you have ideology a lot differently matched between left and right, that's not necessarily an issue. On China, it's an issue we're watching very closely. Ned had a very interesting conference in Accra a few months back talking about this issue of Chinese influence on the media. And it's alarming, and it's an area, of course, that requires a lot of study, because if you look at sort of the ownership structures of a lot of major media houses on the African continent, the Chinese have very strong silent partner interests. In fact, hearing witness testimony from actual journalists who are part of some of these media houses, they actually have a 2-level editorial process where they go to their editor in country, then depending on the type of story, it actually goes to Beijing for a sign-off and a review. That's one thing. The second thing that we're seeing is the role that China plays in terms of influencing political actors and other parts of the state or part of the democratic institution process. We've heard stories and we've watched. I mean, one of the first things that elected parties do is they go to China on a free trip. We saw the new CCM government do it in Tanzania. We've seen MPP and our brothers over there in Ghana do the same thing. When SPLM was elected to power in 2010, the first trip that party apparatus took, 400 people got on a plane and went to China, all expenses paid by the People's Party. So and what are you doing there? Of course, you are participating in tourism and benchmarking, all of those things. But the other activities that you're engaged in is you're learning about the Chinese system, you're learning about the system of government, the way in which the system works, alternatives to democracy. I mean, these are all well-documented sort of activities that occur. And we've seen the same thing of journalists on the continent as well.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, Dr. Friend?
My view is that China's been a breath of fresh air for sub-Saharan Africa and a game changer with the spirit of the new Silk Road. The United States and the West had 50 years since liberation movements to help African countries in infrastructure. And outside the MCC, which is fairly limited, the West didn't do it. The last great investment was by John F. Kennedy, for some of your time, who worked with Kwame Nkrumah to build the Volta Dam project, which was also smelting for aluminum. We haven't done it. So now China's built railroads in Ethiopia, built railroads in Kenya, is building railroads in Nigeria. Once when I was having lunch with President Buhari many, many years ago, he said when he was the military administrator of the country in '84, he heard a railroad and he told his driver, "Follow that sound, I've never seen one in Nigeria." So we're building infrastructure, power plants, water development, ports. Russia is now building nuclear power plants in Zambia. Russia and China are building nuclear power plants in South Africa. Africa needs hundreds of thousands of megawatts of power. It needs millions of kilometers of rail. So who are we kidding? The Africans that I've been to in Sudan, which has been sanctioned by the US, they said we would love it if the West did this, but the West won't do it. The West has a very narrow vision with USAID and other areas. So from my standpoint and from the African standard of living, new Silk Road in China, using public credit to build these projects because the private sector can't afford billions and billions. That's how we built the United States. Study Alexander Hamilton, study Franklin Roosevelt. We use public credit extended for infrastructure. And without infrastructure, no other policy for Africa is going to work because people's standards of living are in the old, the dying, the infant mortality rate,
Thank you.
all these
Thank you.
rates.
Thank you, Dr. Friend. Dr. Firdousi, audience. Dr. Firdousi, you want to add anything to this?
About China, we're not worried about it because China knows something that America doesn't know. There's going to be a political federation soon, and that's why they are spending time on infrastructure.
A political federation in Africa?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Miabe?
I think I see where the gentleman who's standing up over there, where he's going. I see the passion boiling on this. Well, China could be a blessing for Africa, but it could be a curse for Africa also. And part of it is the type of leadership that we have. We have to be extremely careful. The Chinese, and you're right, Dr. Freeman, that the US has not been as aggressive as they should have been in terms of getting involved in the African continent. At the same time, China, I think, from some of those who are critical, they feel like they have ulterior motive also. They're doing a lot of expansion, but they're also implementing themselves. For many Africans, China is another form of colonization that is taking place in the continent. And so we have to be extremely careful when we talk about China. Yes, investments are good, but we have to look at the conditions of those investments. China, yes, they're building a lot of stuff, but we need Africans themselves. They need to think Africa. They need to think about the interest of African people themselves instead of just having a giant, powerful giant who has certainly some calculated interest, who's looking out for their own interest coming from the continent. And in 10, 20 years from now, will Africans will be lost again in another form of colonization by Chinese? That is my only concern.
From a foundation standpoint, what does the Carnegie Foundation, what is their perspective on this? Or do they have one?
So I don't work specifically on China, and so I wouldn't claim to be an expert on it. We do have a China program that is focused, among other things, on China's foreign policy and its increasing efforts to play a greater role in international development and foreign policy more broadly. And I think the National Endowment has done really interesting work on what they call Chinese sharp power. So the many ways in which now increasingly China is not only investing in sort of the basic infrastructure and economic terms that we just heard about, but also really investing in shaping public image of China abroad and the Chinese governance model through investments in media, in TV, and in other places, and through these visits that you mentioned. So really trying to also spread a certain narrative about China. And I think that's one area that we have to pay attention to and potentially also be worried about.
Okay. So before we go to the audience, can you expand on one of the conditionalities of investments in Africa that China seems to always require? A requirement of citizenship for investment, for example. Usually they do it even when there isn't a structured program in place, but they seem to be willing to negotiate with individual actors in order to bring in investment by getting that so-called dual nationality or citizenship for investment. Any of the recent conference that took place in Accra talked about the citizenship for investment that China seemed to relish or make a significant part?
No, I mean, we didn't discuss that as much, but I would say that the one thing we're not talking about here is the cost of these infrastructure projects. When public account audits are done, largely not covered by the media, you see that the actual cost of what it takes to build, for instance, the Salmon Cage Railway in Kenya is voluminous in size and scale. And in fact, the Kenyans are now raising this as a political issue in the country in terms of how to deal with the growing public debt crisis. The other thing that you'll find is what do you get years down the road when you look at that infrastructure? I welcome you to drive down Thika Highway in Nairobi today and see the disaster that it is in terms of the investment that was put into it and now the condition of it just a few years later. I mean, really just, really suffering in terms of quality. The other issue that comes up in this issue about China is the question of what are the values. And when you're asking a question about what is democracy, well, we promote democracy around the world. It's something that we invest in. It's something that we look out for. And China is interested in a specific model, and the West is interested in their model, and you have these two sides going at it. I don't think that the West has walked away from Africa, though, and we see a lot of examples of that. But if you look at the merits of what a structured financial package is, in the case of, for instance, the Mombasa-Nairobi highway that has been put together and is being built by an American firm, there's a number of grants. The interest is much different. The use of local labor and actually employing Africans to do the work and skilled labor. I mean, these are the types of things that you're not seeing in a Chinese project.
Okay, so we're going to go to the audience. The handsome gentleman in the back, if you...
Wanga, I'm a former prisoner of conscience from Cameroon.
Oh.
I'm a Pan-Africanist. I did my research on South Sudan. And why I want to congratulate the gentleman on the issues you've raised here, I think Africa cannot replace one group of bandits to another group of bandits. The West have stolen a lot from Africa. And unfortunately, the whole issue of promoting democracy in Africa has been an issue of promoting interest. Because if there was democracy in Africa, we would not be having the sporadic wars, civil wars, and all the problems we're having in the continent. But China is even going to be worse than that. I've been to Beijing, and I know the way the Chinese operate. I just came back from Southern Africa. I don't think China is good for Africa. The only thing that external powers or external states can do for Africa is to help the Africans shape Africa for the benefit of Africa. We cannot say we are doing these things and then we open up for bounties. Africans steal our resources. That is the reason why the Chinese are coming. That is why we don't have high-speed railways and the rest. All our resources are bankware. They are banked here in the West. They bank it here. Where do African leaders die? They die here in the West. Maybe Zenawi died where? In Belgium. Other Africans are dying in Ethiopia. We have a problem in Africa. The problem we have in Africa is that you guys should help us build Africa. We don't want people to come and give us a plate of rice and take a bale of cocoa. We don't want that. Africa is tired of this type of relationship. Because if we do not stop that, there will be a series of wars in Africa. Even as my brother spoke about the issue of a federation. That is far-fetched. I'm a Pan-Africanist. It's far-fetched because there is a battle now between China, no longer Russia, and the West. And it's causing a lot of problems in the continent. The younger generation in Africa is suffering. The older generation is always okay. So why we welcome China and welcome the West to come to the continent? We want them to see us as Africans, as partners. We are not people that they should always come in and always want to give us handouts and things of that nature. Why carry away our natural resources?
So, my brother, if you were to... thank you for your comments. Well said. But you have a distinguished group of panelists here before you. And some of them are decision makers, some of them are opinion shapers. And you were to formulate that passion and the breadth of experience, length and breadth of experience that you have into a question, what would the question be to the panelists?
The answer is simple. The policies, especially of the United States of America, policy-wise is good. Implementation is a failure. Because that is where the problem is. If you look at the policies of the European Union vis-a-vis Africa.
So the question?
So the issue is Africans should be deeply involved when it comes to implementing policies concerning Africa, even if it is drawn by the European Union or the United States. And if the Chinese come to Africa, they should have Africans on the table to make decisions for the continent. They can't just make decisions for us. That is where the problem is.
Okay. So, paraphrasing the question, how can Africans be more integrally involved in the programmatic...
Sir, before you send that question to them, I also have to say I refuse completely to look at it.
this is our historian here, by the way.
And I'm saying this, I'm really fired by what you put up. My brothers.
But my good brother, please shape it into a question for our distinguished panelists.
I'm going to shape it in a question. But first of all, I have to underline some things.
Okay.
The missionaries come. When they come, they brought education, Western education.
Yes.
And they made us feel like Western education was there to help Africans. Okay? Then we have America, the US. When the US comes in, it has missed out on the colonization of Africa. It comes in with the human charter, the charter, and they say they're coming to help Africa. Russians have missed out. The USSR has missed out on Africa. And it comes in and it says, okay, here we are, we're going to give you the liberation arms to fight these colonialists. Who are the Europeans? Par excellence. Now, China has come in. It's building all these fantastic things that it's building. We are taking it. And we're saying, okay, China is there to help us. But what is China doing? The question is, what is it doing? Why can't we see an African? The problem is us, 50 years, 60 years of independence.
So if you could put the question...
No, wait a minute. I'll put the question.
Yes.
I'm very passionate about this subject.
So am I, and so are they.
Very passionate. The question is, what then? We have the African Union, we're talking about bringing together the Africa. And what are we going to do to move? Are we just going to have a United States of Africa?
Right.
Are we going to have China coming in to give us all these goodies? And are we having these goodies go back to the pockets of our leaders? That's the problem. The problem is us. It's not even the Chinese. It's not even the Europeans. It's not even the Americans. It's us, ourselves.
Bravo.
Okay, let me say this clearly. There is not going to be, look, so long as you have all these peanut-sized countries and a few mangoes or pineapple-sized ones, and you think you're going to become like China, United States, or Israel, powerful, you're wasting your time, unless there's a political federation. And it is not far-fetched. My friend, what you all don't know, there is a new Africa that you all don't know about. The state in Africa are now irrelevant to all the entrepreneurs and the multi-billionaires and the workers. They want to get rid of, they don't have any commitment, the women don't have any commitment. So if you don't have that type of commitment, it's going to be very easy to have the federation. And that's why I have, by 2008, I donated $2 million of my own money for this project. So I know something you all don't know. The reason you say it's far-fetched is because you are poor.
Okay. All right. So poverty is not a crime. Sometimes, but I haven't.
We are Western. We speak the language. We go to the church. We do everything the Western. Africa open the West. The problem is, why is it that the West has neglected us? Wherever the West has been, Japan, South Korea, wherever the West has been. But the West has been with us all these years. Why is it that they are doing nothing in Africa? Is that racism? It's because we are black? Now they have to be very, we have to be serious. Therefore my question to you people is that, does color make difference in development of Africa?
Thank you. Yeah, just remind.
I've given a lot of thought to this because I teach several classes on African history. The West has lost its moral vision. We have shrunk. We don't look at Africa the way Roosevelt did, the way Kennedy did, as an area to develop. We have now narrowed our view of development. We don't see that we can change the standard of living in Africa. So it's an ideological, cultural problem. In fact, the United States has actually been dumbed down over the last 50 years. China's policy, they pulled off a miracle. They've uplifted 700 people out of poverty, and they want to do it in Africa. And I agree with my friend back there. This has to be Africa that does it. There has to be win-win. China benefits, Africa benefits. They work together in harmony for the common purpose of mankind, to develop human beings, to raise their standard of living. There's a wonderful picture on YouTube of a young Kenyan woman who became the engineer and drove the first train of the standard gauge. And they were, as I say, 30,000 Kenyans employed. So the West has a bad outlook. China has a better one for the moment in terms of forward-looking future development.
Thank you, Dr. Furman. So with our sensitivity to the panelists, we need to wrap it up. And if you guys would allow Ms. Barton to just 30 seconds in terms of a question, and then we'll just lead right into closing remarks.
Very quick. Yeah, I just want to ask JT specific few accomplishments in terms of democratization, whether it's on elections or
Thank you.
that you can specific countries.
JT, can you include that in your closing remark, please?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Doctor.
I said earlier, when it comes to civil society or civic space, the overall trend has been relatively negative, but maybe to end on a more positive light, I think we're also seeing in a number of countries the result of the legal restrictions that have been imposed on civil society organizations is that citizens are mobilizing in other ways, right? And we see this across the continent and also more broadly that one of the key ways in which governments or presidents have been deposed over the past few years is through anti-corruption mobilization, for example, right? So citizens are still mobilizing, even if it's in more informal ways, in coalitions, be it against term limits or being against presidential abuses like we now saw in South Africa, where people were following closely what was happening in terms of corruption. So I think that is maybe the more positive spin on it, that even though there's counter reactions on the side of government to that increased mobilization, and I think That's also where we see the use of more innovative repression technologies. Perhaps that is also something that wasn't mentioned earlier in the Chinese discussion, the role China plays in that sphere. But we also see citizens continuing to mobilize, which, for me at least, is a sign of hope.
A number of ideas, a number of successes come to mind. I'll give you one or two. Nigeria, which is fantastically terrible at the issue of persons living with disabilities. It is IRI who work directly with APC, PDP to help inculcate the inclusion of persons with disabilities, not only into the political parties, but as a result of that, for the first time ever in the history of the country, the president has appointed, due to that engagement, a special advisor on persons with disabilities. Now persons with disabilities have, in both major political parties, seats on the national working committees. They make decisions, and they actually properly and adequately represent those people. In Gambia's post-election period, which was quite tumultuous, we're looking at one of the most fragile political successes, democratic successes on the continent. We have seen amazing things come out of the national legislature. While the executive continues to struggle on a number of fronts, the national legislature has passed a number of important laws which IRI works directly with them, not only at a capacity building level, but at a technical level in terms of writing laws about truth and reconciliation process, dealing with the issue of constitutional reform to help reform, including term limit reform, a number of issues. Also, Gambia has a very unique electoral system where they vote with marbles, so helping them deal with that in terms of adjusting to the new realities of technology and some of the other challenges. I can go on and on, a number of countries. The first multi-party engagement of youth in Uganda in the last election who came together, they developed across 16 different parties a single youth charter, which they had each of their 16 parties put into place. And we have now seen even the NRM Youth League come out against Museveni's efforts to increase, to drop the age limit and increase his time in power. So we have a number of successes that we can talk about.
For most of my adult life, I was saddened and troubled by the level of poverty in Africa. And the fact that the infant mortality rate when I'm 5 years old is in the millions per year in Africa. And so I've dedicated myself to changing this. And I must say, in the last several years, there has now been somewhat of a transformation. We're at a propitious moment where, again, because many of you either don't like or don't understand, the China Silk Road is offering a huge opportunity for industrializing Africa. We're seeing it beginning in small steps in Ethiopia. So I'm optimistic that we can begin to change these programs, such as Transaclo, which I've worked on for 20 years. So I think we're at a good point in time. We need a collaboration on policy, we need leaders, we need thinkers, we need people with bold vision who think into the future and do everything necessary to raise the standard of living of people. I think we're moving in that direction. Thank you.
I'm optimistic for Africa. Africa has one of the youngest population in the world. Africa, if you go any place you go, you see the most educated, even among the people who are coming in this country. The migrants are the most educated Africans that are coming here. We have people that are competent all over the world. It's just a matter of leadership in the positions of power. There are interests that are going against the Africans' interests, but Africans themselves have to come together in order to work together and change and take control of their own destiny. So I believe that there is hope for Africa, but we Africans who are here, we need to stand, come together, get organized, and that's one of our weakest points, to be honest, as in terms of intellectuals. Africans are the least organized in terms of group, but individually we are highly achievers. So I think we need to have a different breed of leadership in Africa in order for Africa to change. China, look, they are coming for their own personal interest. They're not coming because they love Africans. The Europeans have come for their own personal interest. So Africans also need to stand for their own interest. And the way of doing it is to having a better sense of leadership within our nations. And that's, I think, where the dilemma in my view is.
Thank you, thank you. We want to thank our distinguished panelists, thank each and every one of you. You may not have had all the time that you needed. However, we hope that you could share your slides and that we could make that available to anyone who may want it for the future. Thank you so very much, everyone. As we get ready for founded in 1995 to advocate on behalf of the persecuted people of former British Cameroons, preferably called the nation of Amazonia today. In 1997, he was arrested for his activism, and 2 years later, on April 6, 1999, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. While in detention, he experienced tremendous acts of inhumanity, including being fed with human excrement and urine for 14 days, mock executions, and sexual assault by female military officers and other forms of torture. After escaping from a hospital, he fled to the Federal Republic of Nigeria, where he narrowly escaped 5 assassination attempts by the state of Cameroon. In 2006, he was brought to the United States as a refugee and successfully sued the Cameroonian regime before the United Nations Human Rights Committee. Dr. Okwanga is a co-founder and Secretary General of the Organization of Emerging African States, also known as the Organization of Emerging States, a US-based charity and chairman of the board of directors of the Ebenezer Okwanga Human Rights and Humanitarian Institute. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Criminal Justice Administration, a Master of Arts in Diplomacy, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Conflict Transformation and Peace Studies. He's an ardent Pan-Africanist, an expert in guerrilla warfare, mentality, and a fierce advocate of the rights of African girl or child. The only thing missing, and I will ask you, are you also a father?
Yes, I'm happily married. I'm a father of 3 and a granddad, of course.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, without any further ado, I want to, I'm not sure with this panel if we're going to have each member come and give some
definitional standards. Then we will not find the plethora of conflicts of Africa. The case of the people of the former British Southern Cameroon is a typical example that from 1961, when the referendum was held to decide the fate of the people on whether they want to join an independent Federal Republic of Nigeria, which gained independence on the 1st of October 1960, or an independent Republic of Cameroon that had gained its independence 9 months before Nigeria, on the 1st of January 1960. The issue of the Cold War decided to betray the already had self-autonomous government, decided to betray human race. That is why at the moment in Nigeria, before President Buhari turned his weapons against the Amazonians who were fleeing for safety. Internally displaced, they could be close to 800,000. Amazonia is a small state, a small nation, I beg your pardon, with close to 8 million people. Nearly everyone in that area, mostly are in the continent. If peace building was meant to prevent situations that could lead to situations like this, I think the people of Amazonia will not be fighting today. Out their heads. They have forgotten about the atrocities of the Biafran War. And the people are equally yearning for freedom. When you go to Zimbabwe, the present constraints of what we call Zimbabwe today, the people of Ndebele land we call Zimbabwe, they don't feel comfortable within that confines. You go to Malawi, there are the people of Barusalam. We all know the situation of the people of Oromo. So we have all these little issues in Africa. The African Organization of African Unity has spoken about the issue of not changing colonial boundaries. But the question is simple. We don't want to change colonial boundaries. And we have part of the Yoruba people who find themselves somewhere within Togoland and Ghana. The Yorubas are all scattered all over the place. You begin to realize how tribes were broken. At times people begin to yearn to come together. And the consequences is drastic. What does the international community do? Rather than react and implement what Boutros Ghali, the former UN Secretary General, has opined, preventive diplomacy, because Dr. Boutros Ghali raised that issue before Kofi Annan took upon it, try to emphasize upon it, and it has never worked. If there was preventive diplomacy, there would be no fighting in Central African Republic today. If there was preventive diplomacy, the people of Ambazonia will not be fighting an active war, which actually the world is almost silent at this moment. They are just getting up from slumber. And if preventive diplomacy doesn't work, even after President Buhari is out of office, I can assure you that Nigeria is going to have a very dangerous, brutal civil war. Because I have been there and I'm talking to the leadership, not just of the Biafrans, I'm also speaking to the leadership of the Oduduwas, those are the Yorubas. I've been with them. Barrow Salam is also calling for the same thing. So the problem we have, solutions to African problems. We should begin to find the possibility to give Africans the options like what the people of Quebec have. When Africans are complaining for something, do not just refuse to give it to them. Because as the evil, temporarily triumphant, is weaker than good. We must understand that if we give the people of Africa, the peoples who are seeking external self-determination for so long, then the issue of peace building becomes possible. Then the international system will seem to be working, and then we will be able to reduce the situation of refugees in the continent. Because while the European Union somewhere wants to open its doors, and the German, Angela Merkel and the others are saying that Germany will welcome each one of you, they have never asked a simple question. Why are Africans escaping from the beautiful continent? A continent with so much resources, both in human capacity and in natural resources. Why are we escaping, taking the very, very dangerous risk on high seas to get to Europe, where we are treated worse than dogs? Now we are passing through Mexico, where the situation is even worse now. Why are we taking that risk? Why can the European Union, the United States, and even the UN not actually address this issue of face value? Where is the morality of humanity? Those are the questions we need to ask when we are talking about the issue of peace building, international system, and refugees. Yet, the very people who have created the situation in Africa are given red carpets. They can fly over in first jet planes with their family members who are sick, and they will hospitalize them in Belgium. They will hospitalize them in Holland. They will hospitalize themselves in Switzerland. They will come even to the United States for treatment. They have several bank accounts all over the place. And when they steal from the continent and bank it here in the West, and if they die, the people of those particular countries don't even know anything about the bank accounts. It is frozen to the benefit of some individual capitalist banks. That money is blown into the capitalist economy. Just the same thing that the Chinese are doing. That is what they have done to Zimbabwe. A lot of their wealth has been banked in Beijing. And now they come back and they are trying to dish in little cakes to the people of Zimbabwe. So, peace building can only work if preventive diplomacy becomes a reality. If we really want peace building to work, then we should begin preventing conflicts. Give Africans the opportunity where consultative democracy can work. Give us the opportunity where if we say, hey, we don't want to be with these people again, give us the opportunity to speak together as one. Or maybe have a referendum as the people of Quebec has had twice. I'm sure the Quebecers, if they were not given that opportunity, they would have picked up arms, even the people of Scotland. So that is the situation, that is the conflict that we have with the issue of peace building in Africa. That it can only work if we can find a means to begin truly prevent the outbreak of violent conflicts within the continent. Then we will reduce Africans being refugees and taking risks that no other human race is capable of taking at this particular time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Gilbert Mwenendata. He comes from a public administration background. He worked for USAID for 10 years in Rwanda, and then 3 years in the Middle East, and he was a presidential contestant in 2017 elections in Rwanda. My goodness, this is join me in welcoming Mr. Gilbert Mwenendata.
Of course, while thanking them for doing that, when I try to reflect to the situation back home in Africa, to me, my philosophy and approach is not necessarily to do what the Western countries did or are not doing, but to see what we Africans, are we doing right, what are we doing wrong, and by doing that kind of self-examination and make sure that we do our part, I'm sure that others will also be doing theirs. And if they don't do that, it's okay, but at least for us, we'll know that we've done our best. So that's why before I say my short remarks for this afternoon, I want to share with you a story from a very good friend of mine. He went to South Korea, I say South Korea, for a training. It was a training on agricultural practices, and while there, he had, I can say, a mentor, and the mentor told him one thing. He said, you Africans, the main problem you have, you are misusing the best resources you have. And those best resources, he said, are land and time. You are misusing your land, you are misusing your time, and if you continue to do that, of course, you will really be not only wasting your time, but also wasting your lives. So why am I saying that? As I said, when it comes to Africa, I really like to see what we Africans can do best. The way we use time is terrible, very terrible. You will see Africans, many Africans, or if I can say sometimes most Africans, late in everything. You see the way they are using time, the way they are really doing business. It's like it's not really what we may wish to be. Why am I doing that in this conference? I'm sure that to organize this kind of conference, there is really a lot that you put into it. But when you come to how many people Africans are turning up to this kind of conference, you say, do we really need to organize one? And if yes, where are they? So, and of course, I appreciate this kind of initiative, but again, when I look to us, I say, maybe next time when we organize a conference, we really need to make sure that we are there and do what we are supposed to do. Otherwise, we'll be wasting time and resources and so on. That was for time. So, as I said, that guy said we are not only losing time, but also losing or maybe misusing our land. Actually, I'm one of those who believe that if we really need to do transformation of Africa, we need to think about our agriculture. I'm saying agriculture because in Africa, we really have a big number of people who are doing agriculture. Actually, more than 60% of Africans are doing agriculture. That's their source of income, it's their source of food, and really if you need to do anything with the Africans, you need to consider that. Of course, I understand the other things like industries and everything else, we need those. But again, the main problem with us in Africa, we don't even have enough to give to those industries. We don't yet have enough harvest so that our people may eat enough. So actually, most of them are still hungry up to date. So that means normally when it comes to the industries, you are thinking very high, it's about value addition. So that means for you to try to do value addition, actually you need at least the production. And with the production, that's how you can get there. So, and I'm saying this because only for this time I really want to be very brief. I know how much time we've been spending here. I don't really want to take much of your time. I may wish to let you have more time for discussion, but I just wanted to put those two before you because I believe on this panel, I'm not assuming that we have any answers to the problems, but all of us together, I believe that if we discuss on any of the things we are saying here, maybe we can find some light that can guide us into the future and see how to make things right in the future. So that's why I really didn't even like to go in all the stuff I have here because I had many. If I go into it, it can take a lot of time, which you probably do no longer have because the day is almost over. But I really thank you so much for your time, and allow me actually to thank in a special way this table. They've been here since the morning. They've been active listeners. They've been doing really much more than what we did, and that was great. I was just looking at them, saying, my goodness, actually, and there is a lot we can learn from them, and that's how you really make a difference. Yeah, that's right. You just take your time, concentrate on something, get an understanding, and then when you go back, you have what to contribute. Thank you so much.
To us by now. He's a professor of at the University of Kansas, African American Study Department. We know that he's a historian. I also got to learn that he's Kenyan, not Luo, but Luya, maybe. And I know he does not want me to make that distinction because he's for broader Africa and broader Kenya. I've just been so blessed to make his acquaintance, and we invite him to make some brief remarks. Thank you very much. And you could either join the podium or you can.
Thank you very much. Again, and I want to say African history is very important. I've been talking to a number of people here, and I do believe that until such a time that we go back to our history and begin to see what happened and where the rains began to beat us, we are not going to go anywhere. Now, we all, a lot of us, and I think everybody here knows Ali Mazrui, the late Ali Mazrui. Ali Mazrui, sometimes back, I think it must have been 1964 or 66, thereabout, when he had just been appointed. By that time, he did have a PhD, but because of his different two publications that he had given while he was studying here at the University of Columbia, he was appointed, and somebody had to stand in for him while he went to Oxford University to study for the PhD. And whoever stood in had to stand in because he had been appointed full professor of political science at Makerere University. But some two people had to come to stand in. One of the people who came was a professor of political science here, and he's now dead. And another one was Professor Colin Lees stood in for him as professor. But he came up with one thing. One of the papers that has always intrigued me about Ali Mazrui has been the so-called Uhuru worship, where he talked about worshiping, that we come in at independence and we begin to think of Africa by looking at our past and bringing those myths to come, throw them on our African people as though Africa was flawless. So there was nothing that was wrong about Africa. And of course, that is going to be embraced. But Mazrui himself was very controversial at the time. At the time when he's giving this, and later on when he finishes his PhD and comes to give his inaugural lecture in I think it was 1967, when he gives his inaugural lecture, and he talks about how important Africa is, how Egypt, is important to Africa, the same way Greece was important to Europe. And then he begins now to look at everything and says, now we have to begin to interrogate ourselves as Africans. We don't need this Uhuru worship. So that Uhuru worship, he begins to think about it and says we have to look at where the rain started to beat us. And this is where I am now asking you, I'm not going to raise because I already talked about these things in the morning. I'm going to ask you how can African history help us to understand where we went wrong? Shall we continue just to keep talking about our past as if our past is the best that we can ever have? I'm leaving you there.
The author, I think, out of Temple University, he talked about, be careful about self-affirmation that turns into self-aggrandization. There's a certain aspect of that as well. So our next speaker, I believe, hails from Howard University. He's been doing a number of leadership training as a management consultant, and I know that I've read from online his wonderful background. I will not do so again. Only just to invite you to the podium, and if you could challenge the audience with your wonderful thoughts as our last speaker.
I would like to continue with the thought that we just had earlier on about our history as Africans, and bring it to the concept of peace building, because we are trying to discuss or reflect on peace during this panel. And I agree with what he said, and we can only be experiencing peace in Africa if we first of all understand who we are, acknowledging the mistakes that we may have made in the past, not worshipping what we are in the past, but acknowledging that we have never been perfect. Just like any human being, if they want to grow, they have to face their mistakes. They have to face their inner personality. So I think this is a good thing that he brought us to. And I'm going to talk about peace starting from there. This morning I spoke about the theories of international relations, which are realism, idealism, and I brought it beyond those theories to speak about constructivism. And I think I'm going to continue on that theme because that was my theme that was assigned to work on, but from a different angle of peace. Constructivism and peace building, see, this is what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, by first of all highlighting the main features of constructivism and bring them to peace building. First one is that constructivism is based on the notion that society is constructed by human beings. It is not given naturally. It has to be built by human beings. It is a process in which human beings have to make the effort to build it. Just like society as a nation, societies as a church, society as a family, those are constructed, socially constructed. And when I bring it to peace, I would also say that peace is also socially constructed. You have to will to make it possible. You have to want it. And if we don't make the effort to bring peace to yourself or to your society, nothing will happen. So my question is this: what does peace mean to Africans, for Africans today? A continent that has been experiencing wars in each country in Africa, maybe not all, but many countries in Africa have experienced war. And today, in 2018, what does peace mean for Africans? And for me, my answer is, peace is not a simple notion for Africans. Peace is an existential condition. It means it affects the core of their existence. Because Africans are longing for peace in order to be able to develop their countries. So for this reason, peace has become not a simple narrative for leadership or a simple narrative from the UN or simple discourse by leaders from European countries coming to give lessons to Africans about peace. Peace for Africans is existential. That means they count on it to be able to construct their lives. The other notion of constructivism is national interest. It's a concept borrowed from realism. And for this, I would say peace and national interest go together for Africans. Without peace, Africans cannot build their countries. Without peace, Africans cannot speak about the interests of the nations. It's only going to be the interests of other people or the interests of a small group, particularly the interests of the ruling class or the interests of the Western people, the Western countries. So this is a very important thing also to consider. Peace comes together along with the concept of national interest, because if we have to build Africans in a very peaceful manner, we have to put the national interest at heart first. Instead of using the interest of a specific group, for example, because we have many ethnic groups in Africa, some groups will privilege their own interests, for example, to the detriment of others, instead of considering the concept of national interest for all Congolese or for all Zimbabwean or for all Kenyans together. So peace and national interest come together. And another concept I would say is that of mutual constructions and structures of agents, means people, when they come together as society, they build things based on agreements. It is not only one person deciding to do that. And that's why we have constitutions, because they have to be agreed upon. And this is a very important thing also for peace, because if there is peace, it means there has been something that made people come together to decide what their future is going to be. And the last one I would say is that of the social structures and resource management. We see in Africa some reason of conflict in Africa is the mismanagement of resources, because some people who are in power want to, I would say, appropriate the resources for themselves to the detriment of the majority of the population, and this creates conflict. And we cannot have peace in the context of resources that are already limited to some extent, which are being captivated by people, just getting into the resource for themselves instead of sharing, instead of building, using the resource for the internet, for the development of the nation, or the national structures, or the education of people, or even health institutions. So peace is also depending on the way the social structures are built for the context of limited and scarce resources in Africa. And that's all I have to say about peace building. And I hope this question can be raised to decide on our future as Africans for peace building in the continent. Thank you.
As we look to the future, as leadership becomes a challenge for many of our nation states, that technology might be introduced in terms of the management of resources through modeling more from the standpoint of a computer. We have smart cities now. We're moving towards smart cities. I wonder if we could have smart nations where we put in basically certain assumptions, the Constitution. We list the demographics in terms of the people, and we talk about the municipal needs, and we make certain determinations based on certain data. Can you imagine for me an Africa that jumps beyond this so-called evolution stages of development and appropriates or uses a certain type of technology that can assure issues of fairness and equity and efficiency? What would Cameroon look like if such a model were to be adopted through layers of peace? For me, if you would.
One of the things which I raised over Straight Talk Africa with Shaka Sani was a problem that is not just affecting Cameroon as a state, it's a problem that is African in its own way. We have a continent which has been imbued by what I call a temporal negative peace for a very long time. In other words, Africa has really not been at peace with itself. You can look at Africa. He just made mention of the issue of nations. Yes, Africa is made of more than 54, 55 nations, but there are very fewer states in Africa because nation building and state building are two different things. And if you don't look at them carefully, you have a problem in the issue of peace building. The reason why there's so much conflict in Africa is because we have not been able to construct states. And part of the reason is because those who are teleguiding us from Washington, from Rome, from Berlin, from Brussels, even from Beijing now, they don't want states in Africa. They don't want viable states, whether we like it or not. So these nations, if a nation is not well constructed, it's bound to fail as a state. And that is what is happening in South Sudan. Nation building has failed in South Sudan. That is why state building is almost inexistent. So we must build a continent that is going to be imbued with what we call the PPP, a permanent positive peace. Peace building talks of durable peace. I don't see it as durable peace. I talk of a permanent positive peace. Peace must be something that is positive, that the people buy into it. It's not something you can impose, because when you impose it, it becomes a temporary negative peace. Fear is what will control the people. And most countries in Africa, fear has imbued the people. Look at South Africa, for example, which is a democracy. The amount of fear that is in South Africa, I can't tell you. I'm just from South Africa. Political killings are taking place every day. As much as you see a democratic setup, there is so much fear in the country. You try to criticize someone, you are brought down. You are brought down, you're killed. You see what is happening in Rwanda, there is development at the detriment of true peace. So look at Africa, we are Africans, we know where we come from. You can count the countries that you could say, this is a country, this is a state. There are very few, but all are nations. So until we move from constructing
real nations, where these nations will buy into the state, the whole notion of state building, so that there could be durable peace, will continue to fail. In Cameroon, to conclude, the problem is that the construct of the independent Cameroon from the very beginning was a failure. When you begin putting your foundation and you make a mistake, a good architect is going to tear it down and start it all over again. And this is one thing we Africans must come to realize. We have a problem that we are afraid to accept our errors. Africa, the way it was constructed with the whole notion of independence, was a failure. I am not saying that we should go back to the European masters. I'm saying that we must tear it down. The African Union does not work. The Organization of African Unity failed. We must tear it down and build something that works for the continent at this particular time. Can we do it? Yes. We have intelligent young men and women who are willing to sacrifice to any extent. We have elders with the wisdom to shape this continent. But we must have confidence in ourselves that we can do it. We must shun away fear that if we try to do a project like this, we'll end up like our late Kwame Nkrumah or Julius Nyerere. No, we should be prepared to die for the continent. Look at Africa as one. Don't look at Africa as a group of 54 or 55 states. From there, we can start talking about durable peace. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. A problem in Ghana should be a concern for someone who is in Zimbabwe. A problem in Zimbabwe should affect somebody in Maputo. If we don't see Africa that way, we are wasting our time.
Thank you. Thank you. Next speaker.
Thank you. Actually, I like the way he ends his comments, where he said we should look to Africa as one, and think that anything that is affecting one African country, it is affecting the other. I also like the way our friend from Congo Brazzaville put it when he was discussing about the term limits. As you can see, it's something that is going across Africa from one country to another. And I think this is a time for us Africans to come together and see how we can be united. And by being united, I'm not talking about the dictators coming together. So that would be a continental dictatorship. But I think those who see the problems we are facing on a daily basis, what can we do so that our voice, may be heard by those we want to communicate to? So by that, what I mean, every day in Africa, we know a country that is either trying to do the amendments for the constitution. We know a country whereby we know some rebels are getting organized to see how they can raise their voice using violence and many other different ways. So I think it's a good time for us to see how coming together can allow us to fight against the dictators, but also make sure that maybe we do it in a way that will end up in another dictatorship. Actually, that's what we've been seeing in Africa. One dictator coming in, let's say a liberator, someone who comes through what they call liberation war. They say it's okay, we've been freedom fighters, and after fighting for freedom, now you got freedom. But with time you realize that those freedom fighters, they became really terrible dictators. So, and it goes on and on. So after one dictator, another one comes in. So I think it's a good time for us to see how we can really be strong when it comes to ideas, those strong ideologies, and not really know how to support our Africans in other countries so that their voice may be heard. And if we do that, I promise we will see that change. My friend did it very well. Allow me to talk about it. For example, about Rwanda. With some of the participants who've been discussing, them expressing some impressive achievements that took place in Rwanda. And I said, yes, to some extent, there are some good things that happened in Rwanda, for sure, that is there. But the problem is only this one. For us, Rwandans, to get there, what it means is for us either to appreciate everything going on, or maybe to speak and know that you will die or go to jail or anything else like that. Right now, as I speak, there is a big number of Rwandans who are in jail only because of expressing their ideas, and with another big number of those who died. So, and when we see that, we say that even though there are some achievements when it comes to economic growth, but there is also, the country is lagging behind when it comes to political rights, when it comes to the freedoms, any kind of freedom, being the freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of any kind. They don't even want to listen. Human rights abuse and things like that, they don't care. That's why I like to say it's okay. I may wish to see some kind of economic growth, which is there and which belongs, of course, to the ruling party and their leaders, not to everybody. But again, I say, what if you get the economic growth, but know that you have no rights in your country? Would you be happy? What do you think? No one can like it. Actually, that's what we want people to know about Rwanda. There is economic growth to some extent, but when it comes to the rights, there is no democratic growth. They don't even want to listen about it. You remember this morning when Malik was doing the presentation and talked about the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC. That's a program that was rejected by the government of Rwanda in 2011. The reason was you are asking too much civic participation, like media strengthening, like civil society strengthening. All those were the things the government didn't want to listen about. And basically the idea was that give us the money, but don't ask us to do anything about good governance, democracy, and so on. So that's all I can say about it. So let's come together and raise those voices that are needed on our continent. Thanks.
I just want to give a slightly different version of how ethnicity and politics plays out and has played out in history. People forget, for example, that the continent with the most ethnicized states in the world today is Europe. Every country in Europe is an ethnic state. That's, accept, and the ones that are not ethnic are having problems. The Belgians, but every other country is an ethnic state. The Serbia, Croatia, whatnot. How did they arrive at that? That the massive withdrawing of Europe happened as a result of the Second World War. Basically, if Hitler succeeded in anything, was in ethnicizing the European state. Now, what are some of the downsides of having ethnic small states? Obviously, the basic economic issues, small markets, whatnot. So what happens? The EU is a direct result of an ethnicization of the smallness of European states. They come together and form a unit called the European Union. And it's now facing ethnic problems. As we see now, the Hungary and all these places. Africa, I do not believe that going down the ethnic division of the continent, or nationalism, ethnic nationalism, will provide any cure for Africa. It will not. The question here is we have to go beyond, you want to throw what they say, throw the baby with the bathwater. It is true, there is ethnic marginalization and discrimination, but the answer is not to ethnicize African state. they will not be viable. Simple matter. How do you propose in your analysis to deal with the question of viability of ethnic states in Africa?
And pretend to be who you are not because all the benefits you may gain by pretending to be another ethnic group. I think in our context, that's what it was meaning. John, is that right?
Right. Shave your good place.
Okay, good. Actually, in our context, we had two main ethnic groups. We had Tutsis and Hutus. And when it comes to the Hutus who wanted to be like the Tutsi, maybe because of how it may look nice in the society, so they were saying that those Hutus are doing like Kwihutura, like denying their Hutuness to become like the Tutsi. Basically, that's what it means.
Now, my question was to go a little further than that. Mahmoud, there is Citizen and Subject, and this other book on Rwanda. What's his name? The title. The title. Okay, he has that. And the first time that I heard Mahmoud Mamdani talk about this is when he was writing Citizen and Subject. That was in 1996 at a conference. And he talked about shedding your Hutuness and acquiring that Tutsiness. Now, when you look at it, and John, I hope you're paying attention because this is, you're talking about it is ethnicizing Europe. And in our case, in Africa's case, ethnicity, when you look at ethnicity, if we are to go by the Rwandan case, you're going to look at that ethnicity is talking about economics. It's moving, it's that level. And the same thing would come to our own ethnic group, the Luya. When you have these people that they call, okay, the Luos, let me start with the Luo, Jodak, those ones who live there, those ones who stay there, because they have nothing, and so they have acquired that ethnicity. They're coming out of their poverty, they're becoming. And so you're going to find that even the Luyas, you're going to have to find those ones, Abamenya, those ones who live. And because they're living, they're shedding off that status, which is not having anything, but because they're living, they're acquiring wealth, so that's going to be there. So my question is, and I'm now coming to both of you, how does this play in helping? Does that mean that the state, the nation state, is a false entity in Africa?
Interesting. Well, let's get into a micro level.
I wanted to respond.
Yeah, I know there was a response.
A little bit of the mix up here from what our colleague have said is that if you do not build a viable nation, you can't have the existence of a state. That is what I was trying to say. I was not looking at it from the perspective of ethnicity. Let me just give one simple example. When the Nues and the Dinkas had their problems in the 90s, there were other little ethnic groups in South Sudan, the Equatorials and the others. But now the Dinkas and the Nues are the major groups. They keep postponing these issues that they could resolve. It was like, we'll resolve it tomorrow, we'll have a bigger bone to swallow, which is Khartoum. Let's get through with the Khartoum issue, we'll resolve it. They keep postponing it. In doing that, they fail to start constructing a viable nation. Because the Equatorials are like a nation. The Nues are like a nation. The Dinkas are like a nation. You need to bring all these nations together to start thinking that they can become a state. They can have a state in that state. In Cameroon, what happened is that the people of Ambazonia were assimilated into something that they had not bought into it. What we say in political science, a buy-in. You need to accept that you want to be part of it. If you don't want the people to be part of it, I can assure you no matter how long it takes, it's going to fail. If you force the Tutsis or the Hutus into something, No matter how much security and development you do, 100 years later, it will come back. So you must make sure they have a buy-in into that nation. They become a viable nation, then they can become a viable state. That is the way I was looking at it. Because you cited Belgium. The Belgian experience is very bad because the Accra is a little bit easy because they don't have many ethnic groups. There are just about 5 real major ethnic groups. So we must be able to move our people to buy into the whole notion of state building or a viable state by making sure the nations are not forced into it, but the whole concept is sold to them because these are individual nations that come together. Remember, in Africa, you are an African historian, we have kingdoms. All these little ethnic groups or whatever we call them, they had kings. Some were independent days, years, many years ago. So we are not trying to bring them together for them to stay together. And then you can build a state. The Ambazonian people had never bought into the concept of the state of Cameroon. We were forced into it. They used weapons. They used all types of things. And that is why when the time came and we said, enough is enough. Now it has degenerated into what nobody likes. Full-blown war. It would have been an easy thing to resolve it if you had sold that concept to the people and let them buy it rather than force them into it.
Is war? We're gonna do a bundle of questions. So we're gonna go, Dr. Fenusi.
When the Europeans came, they put a whole bunch of different kingdoms or ethnic groups together. The reason they did that is because there's something they call economic rationality. They knew they could administer and manage those and establish scales. So I want you, when you're talking about these type of things, you should also bring into play something beyond ethnicity about survival, creation of jobs and wealth and defense for that ethnicity. Think about it.
That's a question. A question for the panel. And as we take those two, both the comment and the question, I want to see if you can wrap up into your closing remarks.
I would like to stress the notion of political behavior in this debate, because it is important to consider that behavior is a very strong engine in creating society. And anything that we've been talking about here is always related to that. The behavior of particular leaders, the behavior of Europeans who came to Africa, the behavior of each individual member of a society, and that is a most determinant thing to me in terms of creating society, in terms of building peace, in terms of trying to transform what we are as society. And to come to my friend who asked if we can call ourselves Africans, I think we can. It is something that we have to own, even though we have some kind of mixed identity, I would say, because I grew up in a French-speaking country and I speak French. I probably would say I adopted the French culture in my way of behaving sometimes, in the language I speak, even though I also speak my own mother tongue. But it is still a possibility for me to say I am African because I decide, I own my Africanness. Mm-hmm. No matter what I am as a mixed personality, I am Africans. I cannot consider myself a French. I only participate in something that is French. I only take some of the French things, but I am African. Somebody told me once, being is something that you also have to decide to be. That is very important. You own what you are, and as African, I own my Africanness, and just like I own my personality, which my Christian nature, for example, my Christian identity. So this is something that it's a choice. And the thing is, we have to do it, to have to make the choice collectively as Africans. That's the most important thing here. I, as an individual, I make the choice, but all Africans, if they want to be responsible for their development, they have to make the choice of becoming Africans collectively. It is not only one person, and sometimes we deny that collectivity because we let some behavior dismantle what we are trying to build as Africans. Political behavior is also key in this part of the equation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll be very again. And I'm going to be brief, really brief. I think we can call ourselves Africans, and we can be Africans, and we can be New Yorkers. We can be people from here and call ourselves whatever we want to call ourselves, as long as we share a certain space and share certain values that we give ourselves. I think that's, we are still Africans because of what we share and what we do. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, also to the question of can we call ourselves Africans? That one is very deep. What I can say is like the more we stay in Western countries, sometimes some of us who have that kind of emotional and cultural connections to Africa, we still feel as Africans, but not necessarily the kids and the generation of, those who are coming after us. So now can we call ourselves Africans? It all depends on how much we feel about our identity as Africans, on how much we contribute to make sure that the best we have in Africa is not lost. So I think that really is within our hands. We will be who we want to be. But I may wish us to be Africans, remain Africans, and let our kids be Africans, because that's who we are, and we cannot disown our identity and be any other nation, or maybe any other people. So we are Africans, and we should fight for it, for us to remain Africans, and make sure the problems back in Africa are addressed as much as we can. Thank you.
You have the closing remarks, though.
Yes, that's a very timely question. I've traveled the breadth of Africa. I've been to the east, to the west, the length and breadth, I beg your pardon. I've been to the east, to the west, to southern Africa, and to some parts of North Africa. Whether you are in Nouakchott or Bamako, whether you find yourself in Windhoek or Kampala, whether you are in Juba or you are in Asmara, even if you are in Tripoli, which is war torn now, or you find yourself in Kigali, Africa is one. I've mixed up with Africans, whether they are French speaking or they are Portuguese speaking. Africa is one. One of the things I did in Southern Africa of late, I just came back, like as I said, after 5 weeks there, was that we are trying to turn our movement into an African movement. We call ourselves the Southern Cameroons Youth League. The Namibians advised that you need to change your name. I said, yes, that is true. I had no problems talking with the Namibians or even those from Maputo, Frelimo members. We are Africans. Until you mix up with the Africans, then you will realize that we are one people. No matter the different languages which the Europeans brought into our continent, we are one. The type of food we eat. I went to Ghana. I was surprised that some of the meals we eat in Ghana is the same thing we eat in Amazonia. They have different names. At times they prepare them almost a little bit different, but they are the same. In Nigeria, it's the same thing. You cross over to Cotonou, you meet the same thing in Benin. So there is no doubt about us being Africans. But the problem is, what is our Africanness? What makes us Africans? Is it that map of the continent that makes us Africans? No. What makes us Africans is that we are the only people in the world whom others came and captured and forced into their own land to build their own lands. When we go there, they later on rejected us even on what we have built. We are the only people. People don't talk about that. We talk of the Holocaust. We talk of genocide in Rwanda. People don't want us to mention the slave trade. You can't. It's a taboo. Because it will bring guilt to those who did these horrible things to us. That is what makes us Africans. That there is no other race that have suffered like us. We are in Australia not because we went there on our own. We were carried there by those who wanted to use us as tools. We are here, most of us, because we were brought here by those who wanted to use us as tools. We built Europe, we built the United States, we've built Australia, we've built part of Southeast Asia. Yet, the African is not broken. That is what makes us Africans. We have never been broken, and no one will break us. We break us, we will remain who we are. And that is one thing we should all be proud of. That as Africans, there is something distinct about us. That no matter our travails and difficulties, if other people had these difficulties we have, look at Serbia. They have been responsible for almost 2 world wars. Serbia, Montenegro. If Africa was like some of these places, this world would have maybe disappeared. But with all our difficulties, the torture, the torments, even what some of our own people are doing to us, we are the most resilient people in the world, whether we like it or not. It's our nature. That is our Africanness. And that is what we must each take home. That we are a special people here on earth. That the torments we get makes us stronger. Let us come together. As our brother is talking about the United States of Africa, let's come together and be proud of Mother Africa. That is the best we can do for the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much.